Intelligence agencies today said that they agree with the scientific community that the virus did originate in China but was not man-made and was not genetically modified. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I haven't seen the report yet, but I will tell you, if you speak to the head of intelligence right now, you speak to the head, they did say that I was given a briefing when I said I was given it, not before. And they also said that it wasn't specific and it was not a panic briefing. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to be invaded. It was in January, later January.
Asked about a statement from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, one that debunks a conspiracy theory suggesting the coronavirus was Donald Trump opted to defend his own pandemic response and theories. That the president implicitly conflates intelligence out of China with reports suggesting he ignored warnings about the virus in his daily briefings for months is noteworthy. It's certainly not lost on critics who suggest that Trump's decision to focus American spy agencies on the government lab in Wuhan is nothing more than an effort to deflect blame from his own lacking response. Joining us now, former FBI General Counsel and MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissmann. We were used to seeing you every day. I've missed your face, and there's so much to talk about. But just what do you make of this? First of all, there are no coincidences in politics, and I do find it interesting that the same week that the Washington Post fronts a story about what was in Donald Trump's PDB, news organizations, including my own, are reporting on Donald Trump turning his intelligence community to now investigate a conspiracy theory about COVID coming from a lab in Wuhan.
So one, I think, positive development, if there can be any silver lining to the coronavirus and what's going on, is that it shows us the president that we have. And the fact that he does not face reality or the facts. Coming up with a conspiracy theory to try and foment xenophobia with respect to the Chinese has just as much factual support as taking Clorox and other household detergents internally as a cure for a virus. And it is really, it's surreal and sad, but I think that this is just yet another distraction, and it can be put in the same category as, fake news from the White House.
Yeah, look, I had 13 different questions for you, but I'm going to put them aside because you just sort of made my brain move in other directions. And I want to ask you this. Are we foolish to think or to have any doubt that he's not squeezing science? If he squeezed the leader of Ukraine for dirt on Joe Biden, he squeezed Rod Rosenstein and Jim Comey and your old boss, Bob Mueller, over the Russia investigation. He's never on the side of the facts, and he's always on the side of his personal either legal aims or defenses or some sort of political motive. Are we foolish to have any doubt that that isn't what's behind him saying today in the Oval he wants to take over the vaccine process?
I think it's very transparent, and I've been actually thinking a lot recently about the very, very difficult position that our expert doctors like Dr. Fauci, who are revered in the medical community, the situation they're in when you compare it to all of the other people prior to the coronavirus, where we were concerned about, why is the person who wrote the anonymous op-ed in the New York Times, why are people in the government not speaking out? And you really find that people who are being squeezed by the White House, and when there are lives at stake and when national security is at stake, they're in a really tough position of needing to try to do the right thing for the American people to save lives. And to have to put up with a lot of politics and, really salacious arguments in order to do their job for the public.
Well, it's such a good point. It's happening in real time. I mean, the other individuals I mentioned are still targets of the right-wing media. operation. Tony Fauci has been a target of the right-wing media operation. He's worked for Presidents Ronald Reagan, first George W. Bush. He worked for my old boss, the 43rd president. He's worked for Democratic presidents. I mean, you've been on the receiving end of those kind of attacks against a deep state. What do you think the experience is like for someone like Tony Fauci, whose work has really never been politicized in anything that approximates what's happening right now?
You know, I think he's doing a remarkable job. You know, I think people can, can rightly criticize here and there on places where, should he be picking his battles better? But, he's in a really tough spot because he is really trying to do God's work for the country. And you'd think that in this kind of environment, you would see the country coming together in an apolitical way. You and I have lived through 9/11. In my lifetime, that's the only other thing that's even remotely comparable. And the spirit in the country after that event was something that really was something that you could grab onto and feel truly patriotic. And you don't have any of that emanating from Washington. And it's unfortunate because I do think the American people are really fundamentally good. And I think Dr. Fauci is a national hero.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.